again. Thank you everyone for coming back after the break. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. He has been one of my best friends since we met at one of Zechariah Sitchin's seminars in Los Angeles in, I believe, the year 2000. He is, besides a webmaster of being many sites, one of them is xfax.com. Jason Martell has done numerous television interviews, radio show interviews, many of which he's invited me to join him, and we've participated together on Coast to Coast a couple times, plus other shows. I think he's one of the best web programmers and one of the leaders in web technology around today. His research into not only Planet X, but other ancient technology like the ancient Iraq battery and other things is astounding. I think you'll find his presentation insightful and very clearly presented. Jason Martell.
All right, thank you so much, Eric, and thank you everyone for coming today. It looks like we're having a great turnout. Now I have a plethora of slides to go through today, so I might be a little fast, but basically I'm just going to kind of give you a visual overload. So what I'm going to be talking about today is ancient technology. All throughout history, there are forms of artifacts that have been found from various cultures that have been miscategorized, if you will, as insect models or some type of sculpture that mainstream archaeology doesn't give it the classification that we're going to put it under tonight. So ancient technology. All throughout history, there are artifacts that have been discovered that have a very anomalous origin, and their function and purpose isn't quite accepted by mainstream science. This one, known as the Antikythera mechanism, served two purposes. It was an astronomical device so that you could chart where you are off the stars and navigating through the seas and using the stars as a navigation point. And it was also an astrological tool where people could tell you, if you were born on March 15th, then your planet sign is Mars, and these things are likely to happen to you. So it was a very interesting device, but what intrigued scholars is that it was more complex than a modern-day Swiss watch as far as the inner workings of the cogs and gears. So this is a very complex object to have come out of history, and it's dated back to around 250 BC. So very interesting piece of technology. And here you can see what it would have looked like fully assembled in its encasing. So another interesting area of technology, this is something that Giorgio and I just recently rehearsed in a show called Ancient Aliens, where in Egypt there are wall reliefs that clearly show light bulbs. And one of the alternative theories as to how they got all these very intricate wall reliefs and hieroglyphics is, one, they were using a torch. The other theory is they were using copper reflective mirrors. When you look into these deep recesses of tombs, there are no carbon soot on the walls, meaning there's no flame, evidence of flame having been burnt. So the only other theory by mainstream science is copper mirrors reflecting the light down these long tunnels, and that just doesn't cut it. An alternative theory is that they were actually harnessing electricity, and we see from these wall reliefs that there are clear inscriptions of what looked to be a light bulb, a very large light bulb plugged into some type of power source. Now what's interesting about these depictions is that, again, if this is a light bulb, then it would need some type of power source. And so, interestingly enough, in that same time frame of around 2500 BC, we find what look to be batteries. And this is found in Iraq, and it's called the Baghdad battery. It's basically just a clay pot with a copper lining and an iron rod down the center. But when you apply a voltmeter to this, you actually generate a positive charge by using any type of acetic acid, or excuse me, acidic liquid. So vinegar, grape juice, wine, and you touch these two rods together, and it actually is generating a positive volt. And we were able to get on film 4 volts from using an object about this size. You figure a modern day battery is around 9 volts that powers our flashlights. Maybe multiply this by 200 and have a huge vat, and you could be generating a significant amount of electricity. Ancient engineering. All over the earth, we have these structures of advanced engineering that if you ask the local people, where do these structures come from? They say they were built by the gods. So how far back do these go? Some of the structures found, for instance, in Pumapuku have unbelievable advanced technology, yet these stones are thousands of years old. Who could have possibly have done this? The only people that we can date back in mainstream science would be people that are using stone tools and living in clay huts, yet they have advanced precision drilling. You can see here on the far right side of your screen that there is actually a mold for molten metal to be poured and to fasten these blocks together. We can see precision drilling in some of these holes. And the blocks fit together like Legos. So very advanced engineering for a culture that's now basically extinct as to who could have built these. So it goes very far back into antiquity. And as Eric mentioned, this infamous stone in Baalbek, and again you can see the perspective of a human standing on these stones. These stones were left broken at the quarry site and then stacked 5 miles away. And we know that because here are the stones, one left at the quarry site that cracked. But interestingly enough, all over the world we have these pyramidal structures, and a lot of them seem to be astronomically aligned to star constellations. So we're seeing astroarchaeology appear all over the world in a pyramidal form, and it really begs the question as to what they were trying to tell us. And obviously, through the work of Eric von Daniken and Giorgio Tsoukalos, I always say your name wrong, it's Tsoukalos.
Actually, it's a Miller.
Okay.
No, it's Tsoukalos.
We see structures all over Europe with the suggestion that there could be a correlation with the planets in the solar system. Pyramids actually marking places in the solar system as actual planets and laying these out as geographical points. So it's very interesting information to start to correlate some of this ancient knowledge and say, this couldn't have just been by chance. Some of these pyramids in South America have very strong correlations to Egypt. The base pyramid size of some of these pyramids exactly match the base pyramids of Giza, and they're aligned to the actual true north in such a way where even the Eiffel Tower doesn't match the precision of these pyramids in their alignment. And you can see the vastness of what we're talking about here. They take up quite a bit of space. So when we look at some of these more infamous ones like Giza, again, amazing knowledge that can be derived from this. Using star constellation maps and computer mapping software, we can basically tell you when the stars are going to be above you and at a certain time in the sky. Meaning a week from now, go outside in front of your house, look at the northern sky, and you're going to see Orion. Great. You can also go backwards in time and know exactly where constellations showed up over the Earth. And it turns out in 10,500 BC, Orion, the 3 stars with one slightly offset, is exactly above Giza. 3 pyramids, as you can see as a satellite photo, 3 pyramids, one slightly offset. In 10,500 BC, we have a terrestrial connection where the objects on the ground are emulating Orion, and the Sphinx, which is the object of a lion, is gazing directly east into the constellation of Leo, a lion. So in 10,500 BC, okay, it looks like we're about ready, so I'm going to go ahead and officially introduce Dr. Roger Lear. Dr. Lear has been doing research into the field of alien implant research for at least, I would say, close to 20 years. He can give us the exact numbers. I've known Dr. Lear for around 12 years myself personally, and have been watching his research as a big fan. And as many of you might know, he does have a worldwide following. He speaks in every continent in the world, and has been doing very esoteric research into the topics of alien implant research and alien abductions. And as you'll see, he has a very scientific approach, and his data speaks for itself. So without further ado, please let me introduce Dr. Roger Lear.
Thank you, Jason. Yes, it has been a few years, Jason. I've watched this young man grow from a young boy into an absolute genius benevolent.
Oh man, you're killing me.
And I watched him aspire to great things. Years ago, he came to me, recommended by another young fellow who said, you need a webmaster to set up a website for you. And I had just the man to do that. His name is Jason Martell. So many years ago, Jason Martell set up my original website, which is still there today, The Aliens and the Scalpel, or alienscalpel.com. That's where the word came from, was from the first book that I wrote, The Aliens and the Scalpel. scalpel. So alien scalpel with ones.com. You'll find it all, and it is as he originally designed it. Of course, with modifications and with modernization. Now, the subject I have to talk to you about, unfortunately, is after lunch. Not the best time, probably, to talk about surgical subjects, but we'll show you very little, and if anything makes you a little queasy, why just look away and it all shall disappear. What I'm going to present to you today is some of the latest material that we have garnered on the subject of alien implants. Now maybe for some it's hard to conceive that there are intelligences that have been visiting this planet for hundreds, thousands, or perhaps millions of years. But if you have that concept ingrained in your consciousness, then obviously they're coming here from somewhere, and we don't like to really put a finger on where that somewhere could be. Are they extraterrestrials that are from another planet within our solar system, other solar systems, other galaxies? Are they travelers through dimensions? Do they live in a different dimension? Are they time travelers? Or are they all of the above? It's not without human logic and reason to consider the fact that if you're thousands of years advanced in science over what we are on this tiny little planet, then you have concepts of the universe and an intelligence and a science which far exceeds our own. So maybe there are things that we can't even conceive of that these intelligences can do. One of the things that has become evident is that there are vehicles that are coming here, and obviously they are because they've been seen all over the world. They've been depicted in the world's human recorded literature. They've been depicted in paintings and cave carvings and so on. As we know, they're biblical, they're traditional, they're religious, they're ingrained in our history. And some of them look the same as what we see today. But is it a stretch then to describe the vehicle? Is it a stretch to look at what's driving that vehicle and what it might be doing here on this planet? Well, I suppose it is. So some of the things that I'm going to talk about might be quite inconceivable, but I try and stay with as much as we know as the academic science fact. Now, academic science can be a tool for good, and it can be a tool for destruction. Always remember what happened to folks like Copernicus and Galileo. They weren't treated very well. To structure a rift through the core of academic science is a leap. And it's very easy to fall into that crevasse and have the entire structure cave in on you. So I try and stay with the scientific fact, but yet we have to deal with the human aspect of all of this because, as I said, these intelligences are interacting with the human race, and they have been for a long time. Now, what is the program that's going on? We know about alien abduction, and at least some of you may believe it, and perhaps some don't, or if you do at least consider it, please consider it more as a fact than a fantasy. I've been in 42 countries in 7 years. It's not much difference whether you're in Egypt or Hong Kong or in South America or in Israel or the United States. The same sort of things go on that you hear being talked about by David Jacobs and Bud Hopkins and Yvonne Smith. These interactions, by and large, involving the taking of ova and sperm, which to me indicates at least some kind of a genetic program going on. Now, since the status quo has kept us in the dark, and we have been kept in the dark, we don't know what we are. We don't know where we came from. In fact, I've been saying lately that basically I think we live in a hologram. Because you get up in the morning, and who are you going to listen to, and who are you going to believe? What you hear on the radio? On George Noory? You're going to listen to the television set? You're going to believe the newspapers? When they tell you the stock market is doing one thing and the oil prices are doing something else? You're going to believe in your cash and your investments? You're going to believe that in the disease, the swine?
All right, folks, thank you so much for bearing with us as we get started here. We want to make sure that all our folks on the internet are actually able to see and hear us as well. So now that we're all in attendance, I wanted to introduce our first speaker, who's going to be John Greenewald Jr. John has a long history of doing research into the field of ufology. He has a very popular site called theblackvault.com. It's in one of the top 5 websites in the world for paranormal topics. And John is also a TV producer and produces a lot of the shows that you might have seen on the History Channel, UFO Files, and of course I'll leave that up to John to fill you in. But please give John a warm introduction and welcome him to the stage.
Well, thank you, Jason. Thank you guys all for showing up so early. Before we get rolling, I must say it's really tough to have the first spot at a symposium, conference, day event. It doesn't matter. When you're first up, I'm telling you, there's a ton of pressures. And when I was driving here, I got up at 4:30 this morning to try and get here on time. Sure enough, we got an hour early, but everything starts going through your mind, like, am I going to trip on the way up there? Am I going to take a drink of water and spill and show up all wet? I mean, is anybody even going to show up? And so last night I had a conversation with my girlfriend, and I told her I wasn't going to point her out, so I'm not going to embarrass her. She's the one with the red face in the front row. And I asked her, I said, well, you know, being first, you've really got to hold the torch. You got to pave the way for all the brilliant speakers to come. You got to grab people's attention. You got to tell them a story, something to grab them. What do you think I should do? And she says, John, she says, you got to nail it right from the get-go. You got to grab their attention. You got to wake them up. It's early in the morning. I see a ton of Starbucks cups all over, coffee, but she says you really got to grab them. And I said, God, you're right. I mean, that is one of the things you do when you lecture. And so one of my first ideas was an air horn. You know those things that you pull out at a game and just come up here and just let that thing wail. And I figured, well, okay, so you guys would absolutely be deaf and wouldn't hear what I have to say, so that wasn't a good idea. So what I decided to do was to kind of step back, just tell you guys a little bit of a story. I'm sure most of you have an interest in UFOs and paranormal related topics, or you wouldn't be here. And so I wanted to start by giving you a little bit of a story. One of the UFO, where are the computers? Just do it this way. One of the UFO stories that has really fascinated me the most. And it's been known through ufology circles as the Bob White encounter. And the story goes like this. Bob White was driving with a friend down a lonely highway from Las Vegas to Denver, Colorado. Absolutely no lights out there. Anybody drives in or around Vegas at night, you know you turn your lights off, you can't see a thing. And so Bob's driving, Bob's in the passenger seat, his friend is driving. And she wakes Bob up because he's sound asleep. It's kind of late at night, probably early in the morning, I should say. And she sees this bright light off into the distance. And she wakes him up, and Bob looks at it, and he's kind of half asleep, and he says, you know, that's got to be a train light. It's got to be some kind of a, aircraft light or something like that. So he goes back to sleep. 20 minutes later, she wakes him up again. This time it's a lot closer. He realizes this is a craft. This is some kind of spaceship, aircraft, something that he's never seen before. And so now his interest is piqued. And he stays up and he watches this thing. They get closer and closer and closer. He realizes this thing is so bright that out there in the middle of the desert, they turned off their headlights and this thing lit up the part of the desert that they were just able to still drive, watch this thing. Now, they finally pull over he gets out of the car and walks up towards the object. Now, he was still about 100 yards or so away. And he walks up to the object and walks towards it. And he said it was so bright and so brilliant. He couldn't see a craft, but he saw a light. And he said, okay, this is something that is just out of this world. And so he said he had to shield his eyes from it. And so he shields his eyes, and the lady in the car stayed in the car. She was absolutely frightened. And she stays in the car, and finally she can't take it anymore. She goes to start the car, the engine lights turn on, and this thing shoots off, according to Bob, like, shoots off, and it joins another UFO in the sky. Now, as it did that, an object was ejected from the UFO, whatever this thing was. That's what you see here. So he goes out and finds where this thing actually lands on the ground, okay? And he goes out, and he describes it as like this glowing hot piece of metal. That was the only way to describe it. And so he goes out and didn't want to touch it. Long story short, finally picks it up with a glove, puts it in his trunk, and there it sat. So now I'm going to fast forward the story by about a decade. He's done tons of investigation, tons of research on this object, whatever this object is. Now, I won't bore you with all the science behind it because, to be blatantly honest, I don't really understand all of it. But the interesting thing is that they've compared the structure of the metal to that of common aluminum, stuff you would find in aircraft, stuff you would find in spacecraft. And in fact, the alloy doesn't match anything. Now, my point here is the fact that he's done a ton of investigation on this. He found this thing in the middle of the desert. This is actually a chemical breakdown of it. And you'll actually see all these rare earth metals in there. It's a pretty interesting topic, but that's not my point. My point is, fast forwarding about a decade, and this is where I come in. I had no idea that I would ever cross paths with Bob White. As some of you know, I filed Freedom of Information Act requests to the United States government, all military agencies, pretty much every acronym you can ever think of. That I filed a letter with them, and they kind of know my name fairly well by now. And so I filed a request to the Department of the Army and requested all documents on UFOs. Now, the Army story is a little bit interesting. They give you about 300 or so pages on quote-unquote flying saucers, but the majority of it is on the Horton brothers, which were Nazi, a pair of brothers that were Nazi designers that were actually one of the first people to design a flying wing. And so I looked through these things and I was like, well, you know, this is really interesting because I have a fascination with World War II. So I looked through these things, but it wasn't flying saucers like you and I think of. This was actually a flying wing aircraft. To them in the 1940s, a flying saucer. And so I got the original schematics. It was really fascinating. But the first 16 pages were really poorly photocopied photographs. And this is what you see. And so there's about 16 of these things. And I see them, and you know, I wondered, well, what the heck does this mean? Now the slide I had before is actually the photocopy of the envelope that says flying saucer from Denmark. Whatever these things were, they were actually connected to a case from Denmark that talked about flying saucers. Now, again, there's no report, no nothing attached. I thought, well, that's really interesting. I don't even know if I should waste the time scanning these things, but I'm glad I did. Because then, after Bob White started his investigation, all of his analysis, he put two and two together. Even though we don't know what kind of craft he saw, even though we don't know the origin, even though we don't know what it was it ours, was it theirs, it doesn't matter. What we did with the documents was prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that the United States government and the United States military has, whatever this piece is, it looks absolutely identical to what Bob White had that fell off of a piece of a UFO. Now you can argue all you want about the Bob White object. He's passed 4 lie detector tests, passed all of them with flying colors. The bottom line is he saw something out there, he couldn't explain it. 10 laboratories have tested this thing, nobody can definitively say what it was. Put that next to documents that say piece of a flying saucer from Denmark. You got a pretty interesting story. So I wanted to start this presentation with this because this is just one file. This is one example. This is one case and one person and one investigator that I've come across, and you go, wow, that's something very interesting. So I wanted to start that way because I wanted to dive into a lot of what the government has on the topic of UFOs. And this, to me, sets it off. Because you've got an eyewitness connected to 1940s documents. Remember, these incidents were separated by 45 years, somewhere roughly around there. So when you take that into consideration, we know we're onto something big. So now I'm going to start a little bit more broad. I'm going to get some water, so I apologize. So again, starting a little bit more broad. Now, what I want to do is tell you guys exactly what the United States government, the United States military connection is to the UFO phenomenon. Now, to best understand this, you have to understand what the United States government, what the United States military says about UFOs. If any one of us goes to them and says, okay, so what is the official line? What's the company line when it comes to UFOs? And it's simply this: they don't exist. UFOs aren't real. There's nothing to the topic. And we did our proper investigation from 1947 to 1969. Some of you may know it. It was called Project Blue Book, ultimately called Project Blue Book. They investigated 12,618 cases. Okay, out of those, 701 remained unidentified. They just said there was simply lack of evidence. Okay, this is their company line. All UFO investigations were stopped in 1969. That's a key date. Okay, so remember, 1969, the United States military says, we're done with UFOs, they're absolutely explainable. The best line in this fact sheet, what they do is they create a fact sheet to tell you about UFOs, what they are. Again, when we inquire, that's what they give you, all of the facts about UFOs. I'm here to tell you there's not a single fact on that sheet, but be that as it may, the last line was the best. No government agency has ever taken an interest in UFOs since then. Okay, so this sets up what they want you to believe. This is actually one agency felt the need to highlight no other government agency has taken an interest in UFOs. Sounds kind of boring, but this is the key point. This is what every Department of Defense agency wants you to believe, what every military intelligence agency wants you to believe, and every branch of the United States government. So that's key. Okay, so we're going to find out if that's true. What the Black Vault says is something completely different. When you start looking at the documents, when you start looking at the agencies involved, you realize that pretty much every agency, every acronym that you can think of, they're all involved. Every last one of them. There's not a single agency that hasn't been connected in publication. JANUP 146, I don't know if I pointed this out, it's a joint publication between the US and also Canada, the Canadian military. And so, getting away from any other country, this is specifically the United States Air Force. What does it say? Report the Survey's records, defines how you do it. Where do you send it? Anybody have a guess?
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Our next speaker is going to be Eric Polterek. He is a longtime researcher in the field of the ancient astronaut theory, has a lot of knowledge specifically with ancient texts related to the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and is a very large advocate of a researcher named Zecharia Sitchin. And he's been studying with Zecharia Sitchin. He's traveled the world and seen many of these places that we talk about in the ancient astronaut theory. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Eric Polterek to the stage.
Thank you. I would like to say thank you to UFO Stream for hosting and producing this lecture, and all of you for coming today. The first thing you see here is, of course, that's me, Eric Polterek. I live in Los Angeles. I'm a stockbroker and a life insurance agent. And of course, my true love is doing this research into our true history, the history of where our civilization comes from, what really happened on planet Earth, and what kind of material, or what kind of information we have not been told. We just heard a lecture of some of the most modern stuff that's going on most recently, stuff that our military is possibly holding back from the culture and the population. This lecture is going to stress most of the ancient stuff that's in museums all over the world. Anybody can see it for themselves. And the emphasis is on how it got into our culture and how it became known to us. This certificate I got from Zecharia after going to several weekend-long seminars that I was actually, I'm one of the seminar coordinators, so we had full weekend seminars. Zecharia wanted to give people the knowledge and ability to do lectures on their own and to give them experience and get a good basis in the material, and then conduct lectures and then go out into different areas and talk about this stuff. So along with the lectures that the weekends I've done with Zecharia, I've been to England, Malta, Italy, and Mexico with him. On my own, I traveled to Egypt, Israel, and other ancient sites. Usually when I go on vacations, it's not on the beach to lay back and relax. I usually explore pyramids or ancient tombs or museums and sites like that. Here you see a picture of Zechariah, and for those of you that are not familiar, I'll explain what his work is embodied in his basic theory. This is a picture from the British Museum in London, which was in our trip in 1999. He's pointing at a tablet that shows many of the zodiac symbols that we're all familiar with today. Zechariah's first book was called The 12th Planet. It was published in 1976 after about 30 years of research. Currently, Zechariah has about 13 books that have been published in over 24 different languages. He's a bestseller in almost every country that he's in, and he sold over 24 million books. For those unfamiliar with the theory, the basic concept is simple. Most, if not all, of a lot of the things that we are familiar with, including biblical stories, timekeeping, record-keeping, counting systems, and a whole bunch of things that you will see are all been borrowed and inherited from older cultures. In some cases, the first culture. And when I say the first culture, I mean the first culture that left thousands or hundreds of thousands of tablets in writing. And for thousands of years, these things have been carried down, and still we maintain them in our civilization today. They are the earliest influences and the first occurrences of these things that we're going to find, and you'll see how they still play a part in our civilization today. Of course, who's talking about it and where they come from, we're going to see, and we're going to be looking at the specific data of what it looks like. Most of the original source material is from a culture called the Sumerians, which existed from 2000 BC to about approximately 4000 BC. And when I say that time frame is based on the writing and the tablets that were found, we're going to see in a moment how we know how old these tablets and these writings are. These are what the Sumerian people look like. There's no pictures of gods here. This is the King Gudea, the final Sumerian king of the Third Empire period. All of these are individual citizens of Sumeria. They're usually depicted in a devotion position with their hands like this, you know, to their gods, giving reverence. Their civilization produced almost 1 million tablets, and they were, well, you're going to see what they look like when they're found, but they recorded almost everything possible. Any transaction between people, I sold you some sheep, we traded some barley, they recorded this on a tablet that exists even to today. Along with those kind of recordings, the king would record what he wanted to say. They would record the mythological stories, they would have festivals and things were read. And so for thousands of years, these stories and this knowledge was around and maintained in form that would not disappear. Most of the tablets are found in this area that we are all familiar with these days. Iraq, the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, the cradle of civilization. The oldest civilizations and oldest cities is down here at the bottom, Eridu, which is the prototype of the word earth. Here we see Uruk and Babylon, Baghdad, Babylon, some famous cities from the old days. The Persian-Iranian Empire is here. Ashur, up here, Nimrod, a famous king. So we're talking about empires that were ruling the Middle East and the Near East areas from, well, as far back as 4000 BC, up until the time when Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire. So we're talking about a 3,000 to 4,000 year period of these people who were dominating the area, their stories, their culture, and everything else that they produced, their methods of recording, of distributing information. In every way, they touched the lives of the people who lived in the areas, plus the future generations. Okay. This is called types of data. Now, this is what we're going to be looking at. Class 1 data is what we're going to be seeing today. Class 1 data is verifiable and scientific evidence. It means it's physical. There is something to touch, there is something to see, there is something to study. It may be in a museum, it may be behind a piece of glass, but the archaeologist touched it. The person who dug it out of the ground found it, cleaned it up, recorded it, discovered it, made a description of it, and now it's on display. So it doesn't mean that we personally have to touch it, but some human has to have seen it or touched it. So what I have here, most of the reports that we're going to see is called here a class 1 data once removed. That means I'm given a report, on Class 1 data that I studied or somebody in a book studied it and we're reporting it today because we're obviously not going from museum to museum. Class 2 data is there's no evidence left to study, but multiple witnesses saw it. The example I give here is a shooting star. Another example would be a UFO experience. Many people see a UFO, there's nothing left. Each of those people know what they saw, but you can't tell people that were in a different city, oh, this is what I saw. They'll either believe you or not. It's based on their trust and faith in you as a witness. Type 3 data. It's only one person who saw it. There's nothing left to study. Guess where most of the material for UFO contact cases or UFO witness sightings are? Is type 3. But you know what else is a type 3? Religious testimony. Biblical documents. Biblical stories which were recorded thousands of years or hundreds of years or decades after events. No evidence left, just written on a scroll. That's what most of religious testimony is. So the problem is, in the case of UFOs, everybody wants the physical evidence to study. In the case of religious testimony, we would also like to see physical evidence to convince us. But that's just not what happens in the reality. So we have to weigh different types of data and determine which is stronger and which is a stronger form to add to our belief, take away, or to give us knowledge that we use for our daily life to benefit us or not. Welcome back, everybody. The next speaker I have for you is very exciting. You may have recently seen him on Ancient Aliens, on the History Channel, which he was a consulting producer for. He works very closely with Eric von Daniken, one of the oldest, longest, and most famous proponents of the ancient astronaut theory. He's the chairman for the Center for Ancient Astronaut Research. That is part of one of the projects Eric von Daniken does. And he's the publisher of the legendary Times magazine. I'm proud to introduce Giorgio Tsoupolis.
How you doing, everyone? Everyone good? This is one sweet setup, huh? Yes? Hello. How are you today?
Thank you for sending me lovely infos. I was also studying with Eric von Daniken.
Really?
He was my colleague.
Fantastic. I appreciate that very much. So, wow, what a great turn up for a Saturday. Pretty awesome. I just stepped off the plane from Phoenix, Arizona, where I filmed my 3rd episode of UFO Hunters in front of some petroglyphs. And the show will have a very fast turnaround. So 3 weeks from now, it'll air on the History Channel, Wednesday night, 8 p.m. So please tune in.
We will.
All right, without further ado, we have a lot of slides to go through. So let's just start. Oh, and welcome to everyone watching worldwide on the web. It's pretty awesome that Jason Martell has set this up, and with such sweet technology that, you know, it actually works, which is great. So, whoa.
Sometimes the mic works a little too well.
You can still hear me though, right? So, all right. So, let me just, okay. Let's do it the manual way. There we go. All right. Eventually, mankind will venture into outer space because we are a species of explorers. So right now, the ISS is being built. Eventually, the space shuttle will get improved. Eventually, we will go back to the moon. This is actually a concept of what the next moon rocket will look like. And here's a comparison with the current space shuttle, and all the way to the right is the moon rocket that we'll use in about 5 years, and to the left is the Saturn V, Saturn V, which went to the moon back in 1969. And as with all things, we'll start out really, really small, set up a couple of, you know, components up there, and start mining and so on and so forth. But then, as time progresses, our base will grow bigger and bigger and more sophisticated. This looks like almost like the Death Star in Star Wars. So, I mean, obviously, these are all concepts and ideas. This is not, you know, a concise vision of the future, but this is something what might occur. So then, after we've built bases on the moon, the next logical step will be to visit Mars. And we will do this with more sophisticated ion-propelled spaceships. We'll start small once again, and then expand our bases on Mars. And then we are truly visiting the final frontier, deep space. We will go out there. I'm not saying it's in 20 years. I'm not even saying it's 100 years. It might be in 500 years. And that's just the reality of the level of technology that we have today. But when we arrive, oh, by the way, in order to get there, you know, the critics always say, oh, the distances between the stars are too big. So what will happen is that we'll use something like a generation starship. And that actually has been conceptualized already in the 60s by NASA. So this is not some, you know, people talking out of their behinds. I mean, this is really something that has been mathematically constructed and proven that when you have a generation space, that the distances between the stars are big. And with our current technology, we really can't get any far, you know, can't get far. So what will happen is that not the same crew that will go out there will actually return. It'll be 4 or 5 generations after, so you're basically procreating on board of the spaceship. And in order for this to happen, the spaceship would have to have artificial gravity. And one way of creating artificial gravity in outer space is if you have a round wheel like this that's, you know, rotating on its own axis, and thus you create artificial gravity. So it's basically like living, you know, in this big gigantic wheel. And on the inside, it would look something like this. Again, this is a concept, this is an idea. You know, the first ones will be much, much smaller than this, but this is approximately what this will look like. And it is all, you know, possible to do this because if you have a wheel that's rotating on its own axis, all the water, everything will be pushed out against the walls. So thus, it is possible to, you know, for you to walk around, you know, not floating in anti-gravity and all of this. So eventually, we will reach a planet. And that planet might host intelligent life. But technologically speaking, that life is not there yet. As in, they're intelligent, or, you know, pretty much there. However, technologically speaking, they're still primitive. So they might still, you know, use flint to make fire, and who knows, maybe they're not even there yet to make fire. So what will we do? Will we just stand back and watch and say, no, we'll have to keep something what Star Trek refers to as a prime directive? I say, no way. Our egos are too big for us to just stand back and say, oh yeah, let them just toil around. What we will do is we will help them a little bit to push them sort of in a technological direction, you know, teaching them about mathematics, teaching about engineering, about architecture, agriculture, all these different things. And eventually, we will become the gods that have visited their planet thousands of years in their past. And so, this is the basic premise of the ancient astronaut theory. If something like this that we will do in the future, why can't it be that this has happened here on Earth 16, 17, 18, 25,000 years ago? And the truth of the matter is that it has, because here we have a picture of a helicopter landing on a South Island, an island in the South Pacific. And the natives, and this happened in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, where the natives, when the Second World War was going on, and all the subsequent wars in that region, you know, the soldiers arrived in their planes, and the natives, for the very first time, had contact with, quote unquote, an extraterrestrial society. Now, by all means, they are not dumb people, they are not stupid. It's their technological frame of reference is totally different than what we're used to. So what happened is that if you, by the way, Eric, may I borrow your laser pointer, please?
Yeah.
That'd be really sweet. How are we doing? Yes, everything is great now. I appreciate that you're at 138. That's fantastic. Sweet. Okay, great. Hey, thank you very much. Okay, now, see, when the seaplane landed, they didn't know that it was a plane, but it was a mythical bird. And they described it in their traditions that it's a mythical bird. And mind you, this is all happening, you know, at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, every night, the natives paddled out to the boat and write this thing right here, that's a pig. So they sacrificed a pig to placate the mythical bird so it wouldn't make so much noise, because with the noise, that means the plane, or the mythical bird, I'm sorry, is angry. So they, sacrificed the goat, I mean the pig right there. So, I mean, right there, this is what's called a cargo cult. After the Second World War ended, the Americans went back home in their planes and with their boats and all this, and 10, 20 years later, ethnologists went back to the island of Bebak, this one is, and the ethnologists were absolutely astonished, because what had developed is this, that people rebuilt planes made of straw, and every night they re-performed these quote-unquote rituals for these mythical birds to take off into land, for the gods to arrive or to return. Now, what we have here in ethnological terms is known as a cargo cult. And cargo cult is the basic premise of the whole ancient astronaut theory. And it basically says, if this was possible in the early 20th century, then why, on our planet, why couldn't this have happened, 2, 3, 4, 10,000 years ago? And what I'm about to show you tells us that yes, it absolutely did happen. For example, India, treasure trove of ancient astronaut stuff. Up here in this painting, you have these gods flying around in what's called